I'd like to welcome Arthur Manuel from Toronto, from Seaton House, for some unbelievable and totally crazy reasons, none of which are his or Seaton House's responsibility. He was unable to be here in person, although we both very badly wanted for that to happen. This is our next best, so he's larger than life, joining us via Skype today, and very grateful that he can be here to share details about Seaton House's managed or measured alcohol program, which was just raised in the last question. Your presentation is very timely. So thanks for joining us, Arthur.
Well, thank you folks for inviting me. This is the first time that I've ever done this type of presentation, so bear with me, and if you can reduce my harm, that would be quite helpful. I think I've wondered how to do this because not having done it before, but I think what might be helpful for everybody there is to sort of hear our history on how we got here. And we've been running this program now for about 14 years. Very similarly, it started because of a coroner's inquest into the freezing deaths of 3 chronic homeless alcoholic men. And that inquest at the time, 1995, was several recommendations. About 21 came out of the inquest, but 2 were acted upon by the City of Toronto in trying to establish what was earlier described as a wet shelter approach, but in fact there was no real information because a wet shelter hadn't been done before. So the one recommendation was indeed to start a wet shelter or a managed alcohol program. There's been a lot that's happened since. 14 years is a long time, but it's also a short time in a way. This community existed long before we started providing services to them. In fact, in some shelters in Toronto, in most shelters in Toronto rather, all of the service were abstinence-based. So if you, in fact, showed up at a shelter intoxicated, you may not be served. And as a result, you would be left to your own devices, which really left you on the street. There was a few shelters at that time that did allow people who were intoxicated to come into the shelter, which was, I think, in some ways, some of the discussion that's going on now, although out of a shelter context and into sort of a detox context. But some programs did allow for people to enter the program intoxicated, as long as their behaviors weren't too disruptive. So we kind of refer to that early beginning as a sort of damp shelter approach to services. And we provided that in Toronto within a year after the inquest, which helped a great deal to organize an opportunity to give folks sanctuary who needed support while they were intoxicated. About a year in after we started the program, we recognized that there were some things that were happening with this population that were difficult to manage within the context of a 12-hour or respite approach to service. And some of the difficulties were we were losing people along the way. Sometimes they wouldn't return. We would start a search for them, looking in some of the obvious places. Usually the phone calls would start with the local police station to say, have you seen so-and-so? And if not, we would sort of continue the search. Our next call would be the local hospitals and find out if anybody turned up there. And oftentimes people would, but they would be booked in because they were intoxicated as John Doe. So that gave us some indication that there may be somebody there that we were caring for, but we really couldn't be sure unless we went and checked further. And if both of those 2 places we searched didn't turn up anybody, our last call was often the morgue, and oftentimes we would find somebody there that we were looking after or caring for. So there was obvious places to look. The other thing that happened along the way as we went from a sort of damp shelter to a full-out alcohol management program was there was an interesting type of phenomenon that seemed to happen. But when people who had been drinking for a long time, and we're talking in most cases of folks who are 20 years in terms of their addiction or better, when they were provided with sanctuary or somewhere to stay, we often found that the next thing that we witnessed was them getting very sick, which was a bit of a paradox for us because, in fact, we were saying you're doing much better with your drinking, you're not being picked up by the ambulance, you're not intoxicated. And they would look back at us and say, well, I've never felt so shitty in all my life sobering up. And this for us was a bit of a revelation because it started to sort of uncover some things that we really didn't anticipate, which was that, you know, underneath all of this drinking, there was a person there that was probably quite unwell physically and may have had physical health problems that were underlying all of this drinking and intoxication. So one of the issues for us was to think about that group that wasn't returning, the group that seemed to be settling into accepting services. Although they were accepting of the services, they were becoming quite unwell. So we started about a year later with a full-out managed alcohol program. And I guess what would be interesting for people in Vancouver would be that we didn't really have a model to work with. We kind of had to invent something. So we tried by simply, and I'm not recommending this for you guys, but if you were to take this on, but we tried by just putting alcohol on the table and seeing what happened. That was a disaster. We would, again, we certainly wouldn't recommend that you do that, but we had to find a baseline where to start.